Too scared.
The desert was unnaturally red in the dying light. The barren landscapes of dry, stony ground and the towering mesas in the distance were all composed of the same red-hued sandstone, so that even during the day, everything appeared to have the same coral tint. But as the day wore on and the blue skies began to dim into darker golds and scarlets, the entire desert was left with deeper, blood-red hue. For vast stretches of the desolate crimson wasteland, the uniformity of color and quiet stillness of the desert twilight remained unbroken, until reaching the jarring contrasts of bright lights, whimsical music, and extraordinary smells of the carnival. Even though the carnival had set up very deep into the desert this time, people from the towns still came. The posters and flyers were distributed all throughout the towns 2 weeks before they came. Every child saw them. Every child wanted to go. Even the most unwilling parents were swept up in the excitement that the rest of the people felt. Everyone had a friend or acquaintance that was going. There was no reason to be a stick in the mud about it. Tommy Gressel's stomach rumbled again. The hot dogs had smelled so good earlier as he walked hand in hand with his parents past the white and red striped tents. Father's large, rough wrist swallowed Tommy's left hand in a firm grip, while Mother's smaller, smoother palm held his right hand in a clasp no less firm. Tommy had wanted a hot dog then too, but they were moving too quickly, too determinedly through the crowds, and Tommy's parents probably wouldn't have heard him anyway. Now the crowds were almost gone, with just a few stragglers left, their dark silhouettes against the blood-red desert sky passing through the small city of red and white tents. The hunger had become almost unbearable. Tommy's sugar-laden lunch of funnel cakes and cotton candy was just a distant memory now, his 10-year-old metabolism having forgotten the short-range fuel and demanding something more substantive. The hot dog vendor had to be close. Tommy could smell it more strongly now, the warm, meaty scent dominating the competing scents of candy from the vendors and oily grease from the cheap carnival rides. He hadn't wanted to leave Mother and Father, but they were ignoring him now, and he didn't know why. They had been attentive, even annoyingly so, before the fortune-teller's tent. The thin man with strange eyes had talked to them very intently from across the table. Tommy had kept his eyes on the beautiful glowing orb in the center of the table, fascinated by the slightly shifting shapes he could barely make out within, like in his lava lamp he had at home. But Mother and Father had kept their eyes on the strange man, both of them sitting rigidly in their seats as he continued to talk to them in a slow, sing-song voice. After a while, Tommy tired of watching the shifting shapes, as his protesting stomach demanded food. He had tugged on Father's sleeve, called for one or both of them to help him find some food, but neither responded. They continued to sit rigidly, staring at the thin man with the bony face and tall hat across the table. After several more minutes of unsuccessful attempts to gain his parents' attention, Tommy came to a decision. They were clearly busy and didn't want to be disturbed. And Tommy's father had given him $5 to spend however he wanted at the carnival, hadn't he? It was only logical that Tommy get a hot dog himself while his parents were busy. They probably wouldn't even notice he was gone, and he'd be back in just a few minutes. The way back to the hot dog stand was not as easy to remember as he had hoped it would be. After making his first wrong turn at the old stage with the stained emerald curtains, he found himself wandering down the midway. The sounds of laughter and jeers as games of chance and skill were won and lost echoed around him. Tommy kept his eyes on the next tent he intended to pass through, for what he hoped was a shortcut to the hot dog stand. And then he saw him. The tent flaps of the canvas pavilion he was headed for parted, and the clown stepped out. But it wasn't just any clown. It was him. Tommy had first noticed him earlier, when he was riding the Dumbo ride. The ride itself was a rusty contraption, little more than a circle of track with a slightly raised track on one side. The faded white and slightly chipped cart that resembled an elephant would roll up the hill slowly, then rush down the other side each time it made a loop. His parents were watching from outside the short metal fence that surrounded the ride, clapping and cheering each time Tommy's cart flew down the small hill. Even though it was only about 5 feet tall, Tommy liked to strain his neck to look around each time the cart crested the hill to view the rest of the carnival around him. It was on the cart's third time up the hill that Tommy noticed the shining, eager eyes of the clown, watching him from inside the broken carousel ride. He stood as motionless as the frozen unicorns and carriages around him, his glistening eyes locked on Tommy. He appeared to be of average height and weight, with a slightly jowly, stubble-covered chin and neck. He was bald on top, but still had long hair around the sides of his head, dyed a brilliant red to match the makeup on his mouth and nose. Stark white face paint covered the rest of his visage, and even over the top of his balding head. He wore a yellow and blue jumpsuit with red buttons up the middle. That was all Tommy could see from his vantage point on the ride, before swooshing down the hill once again. But it was the eyes Tommy remembered most. The ravenous eyes. They stayed locked on Tommy each time he crested the hill, and Tommy began to dread rising up the hill each time, when the eyes would once again be on him. Mother and father, watching Tommy closely, had noticed the change in their son's demeanor and followed his troubled gaze, but could not see the clown from their vantage point. The faded test of strength booth stood between them and the broken carousel. When the ride was over and Tommy rejoined his parents, they asked him why he seemed worried. All Tommy could do was tell them about the clown watching him, and that it made him feel afraid. This seemed to give them some measure of relief, and they reminded him that there were many clowns at the carnival, and sometimes they might accidentally look scary. But now, as Tommy stood frozen in place, the same clown from the carousel exited the tent, and once again he locked his craving eyes on Tommy. Tommy wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. He watched as the clown eagerly stepped towards him, his oversized red shoes quickly covering the space between them. When he reached Tommy, he glanced around quickly before looking down at the boy. "Where are they?" The voice was soft, almost childlike. Tommy didn't know if it was how the clown actually spoke or if he was trying to make his voice like that. Months ago on Tommy's birthday, his parents had given him the rare permission to have as much cake, ice cream, candy, and soda as he wanted. The offer was good for the entire day, since it's not every day a boy turns 10 years old. Tommy knew better than to waste such an opportunity, and spent most of the day eating and drinking the sugary treats as much as possible. And not just in one sitting, but even after swimming, he'd come inside for another piece of cake and a bowl of ice cream. After playing tag with his friends, it was time for another candy bar and soda. Even when he really began to tire of sugary things, his brain told him the offer was only good for one day, and then it was back to vegetables and casseroles. He was obligated to himself to eat as many sweet treats as he possibly could. By the end of the day, the sugar sat hard in Tommy's stomach. His head hurt, and the idea of eating anything sugary again repulsed him. The oversweetness of the day, the overstimulation of his birthday party with so many friends and their parents left him feeling sick of both sugar and fun in general. As the clown looked down at him now, that same feeling returned. It was as if the feeling of having too much sugar were personified in front of him. It was, in part, the oversweetness of the clown's voice, combined with his makeup-masked face and hungry eyes. His garish, bright costume seemed to indicate he was from a fantasy world of pure fun, but the small rips in the fabric and the faint sweat stains around the neck and armpits were reminders of a grimmer reality. Tommy understood who the clown was referring to when he asked where they were, but he felt no inclination to answer. He felt the clown would know if he was lying, if he said his parents were nearby, but telling him that they were further away sitting stone still in the fortune-teller's tent was not an option either. Suddenly, Tommy found that he could move again, and he quickly darted to the right towards the target shooting booth. The clown quickly reached out a hand to grab him, but Tommy had moved too fast. The following shout of, "Hey!" from the clown revealed that his voice was indeed deeper and stronger than a child's. It also caught the attention of the carny who was manning the otherwise empty booth. He was a skinny man with a straw hat and a red and white striped vest. He leaned over the counter, prepared to reach out and grab Tommy as he ran past the counter. The booth had a mostly solid half wall that participants would stand behind as they picked up a BB gun and fired at the ducks, UFOs, and other moving target shapes at the other end. But on the far right side, there was a simple wooden plank on top that could be opened or latched shut. It functioned as the door for both the worker to enter and exit from behind the counter, but there was no wall beneath it. Though it was latched and locked, and though it stood only about 4 feet from the ground, Tommy found he could run at full speed directly underneath it, only needing to duck his head slightly. By the time the carny and the clown saw that he was not running past the booth, but through it, Tommy was already halfway down the length of the booth and rolling underneath the tent fabric of the far wall. The tent he had just rolled out from became a rumble of activity, as the much larger worker inside attempted to follow Tommy the same way, only to find that the tent fabric wasn't loose enough to easily allow a full-sized man to roll underneath. Tommy wanted to find help, but if the nearby carnival worker had been instantly ready to aid the clown in catching Tommy, then could any of the carnival workers be trusted? Probably not, Tommy knew, which left his only option to try to find protection from one of the fairgoers. Only, there were none. The thinning crowds that Tommy had seen earlier had now completely vanished, leaving other carnival workers as the only other people in the near vicinity. The carny was beginning to emerge from under the tent that Tommy had just rolled out from, but the clown was nowhere in sight. Tommy began to run blindly, looking for anywhere to hide. The air was heavy with the deep-fried smells of unusual foods and of hot plastic from the bags that encased toys and candy. The scents Tommy had found so exciting earlier now filled him with dread. They were not natural smells. Nothing was natural here. He longed to be home, in his bed, the smell of fresh-cut grass drifting through his window. Taking a few more sharp turns by the games and rides and tents, Tommy ran into the large, now empty area of the knife throwers exhibit. Earlier that day, Tommy and his parents had stopped briefly to watch the knife thrower hurl his sharpened projectiles at the brightly painted wheel at the far end. Tied to the wheel was a woman, dressed as a court jester. Her face was painted like a clown's with a cartoonishly large single tear painted on one cheek. Her mouth was covered with rope, and her wrists and ankles were bound with the same rope to the wheel, which slowly turned. The knife thrower was joking with the crowd, telling them how hard it is to get anyone to volunteer for the knife thrower's assistant position. The people jeered and laughed as the blade thudded into the old wood, only an inch or two away from the bound jester's head. The knife thrower had twirled another knife on his finger, and explained while this particular jester had tried to betray them, she also owed them. So she would repay them by starring in many performances still until he allowed his aim to slip. The act was quite convincing, except the jester's eyes had betrayed no fear, only a silent kind of resignation. Tommy remembered thinking that the jester should act more afraid to make the show more convincing. Now the wooden wheel was empty, the ropes gone from the holes that had held the jester in place. Behind the wheel was a red and white tent, which Tommy dashed inside. He was about to run through the tent to the other side when he heard a voice outside the tent flap he was headed for. "I think I saw him go in this one. I'll take this side. You better make sure he doesn't double back the way he came." Tommy froze, heart thudding in his chest. Frantically scanning the tent's interior, he saw a large coil of rope against the corner. He practically dove into the rope, pulling the top of the coil over his head. It wasn't a perfect spot. There were still gaps in the rope he was afraid someone would be able to see him through. But there was no time. The tent flaps he was about to exit from opened, and the carny from the shooting gallery walked in, angrily scanning the room. And then Tommy's blood ran cold. What he had failed to notice in his frenzied scan of the room was the jester sitting against the opposite wall of the tent. He could see the white-painted face with the oversized teardrop through the openings in the rope. And that face was staring directly at him through the openings in the rope. Just when Tommy thought he couldn't feel fear's grip on his stomach any harder, it clenched even tighter as another voice entered the room. "Is he here?" It was the childlike voice of the clown again. He had entered through the same opening Tommy had, but he was behind the rope coil so Tommy couldn't see him. "If he was, he must have run out," the carney responded. "I thought I saw him come in here, though." The clown let out a soft sigh. "Check the next 3 tents." The carney instantly turned and ran back out. The clown had walked into Tommy's view now, his starving eyes slowly going over every possible hiding spot in the tent. "If you're in here, little one, you can come out. Don't be afraid. I just want to show you something very special in the funhouse." The voice was extra soft now. "Are you hungry, sweet boy? I can get you a delicious treat. I get hungry for things too sometimes. You know, when you get bigger, you get a different kind of hungry sometimes." The clown's voice would trial on and off again as the white-gloved hands picked up buckets to look underneath them and pushed aside stacks to look behind them. He suddenly smiled, straightened, and started walking towards Tommy's coil of rope. A loud clang on the other side of the tent caught both of their attentions, as the metal chair the jester was sitting on had tipped over backwards, the jester still sitting in it. Tommy could now see that the jester hadn't moved because she was tied to it. She struggled ferociously at the ropes, trying to slither out the top. The clown turned and strode over to her, the metal chair continuing to make scrapes and clangs on the ground. "Oh, no, that won't do." The clown's voice started the sentence in the same soft, childlike cadence he was using before, but slowly lowered his pitch until it was deep growl by the end. Tommy silently sprang from his hiding spot and sprinted towards the tent flaps he had just come through. His half-crouched, half-run came to an abrupt end as he watched the shadow of another man outside the tent coming inside. His heart in his throat, he skidded to a halt, turned and ducked behind an old crate, one that the clown had just looked behind, as the carney that had exited moments earlier came back inside. "He's nowhere nearby," he panted. The clown had picked the jester up off the floor by her throat and set the chair upright again. He turned to the carney. "That must have been where he went." The clown made a childlike pout. "But I didn't want to share him." His eyes were blazing with anger, and he stormed over the rope coil. "I won't!" The top coil of the rope was furiously pushed aside to reveal the emptiness within. The clown suddenly stood up straight and let out an inhuman, ear-piercing shriek. The carney winced. "If you find him there first, sir." The clown didn't even look at the carney. He continued to stare at the tent wall for a few seconds before turning to the jester. As if in slow motion, the clown crouched in front of the jester so that his face was right next to hers. His voice was childlike and soft once again. "Where were you going to go? Run across the desert on foot? Try to steal one of the leftover cars? You know we already pulled out all the wires that make them go." The jester said nothing. She continued to stare straight ahead. The clown suddenly let out a shrill, childish laugh. "You're so silly!" He pulled off a white glove, revealing hands that were almost as pale as the material that had covered them. Long, sharp fingernails, slightly yellowed, protruded from the end of each finger. The clown slowly scraped one pointed finger across the jester's cheek, leaving a bright red trail across the bright white cheek. Slowly the clown put his finger in his mouth and made soft sucking sounds. The carney shifted anxiously on his feet. "Sir, I think the feast has already begun. We don't want to be late." The clown continued to stare at the jester silently for a few moments, still sucking on his finger. Then, without a word, he rose and left the tent, the carney following close behind. Tommy sat trembling behind the crate. In his fear, his brain had only been scanning the conversation for any hint that they knew where he was. He hadn't been actively listening. Now, as they left, he struggled to remember what was said. He slowly stood before once again remembering the jester too late. She was still watching him, saying nothing. Was she helping him? She had said nothing to the clown or Carney to indicate where he was, but then again, maybe she couldn't speak at all. Tommy wasn't sure what to do. She was tied up, but would she grab him if he untied her? Was she tied up because she was even crazier than the rest of them? And could he untie her even if he wanted to? The knots were huge and the rope looked very thick. His small hands probably lacked the strength to undo even one of the knots. The jester continued to stare before slowly turning her head to look at a barrel across the room. It was an old wooden barrel with a faded yellow star on the front and the name of the carnival printed below. Tommy hesitantly walked form around the crate. He had to get back to the fortune-teller's tent to find his parents. Surely he wouldn't be in danger once he was back with them again. He went to the tent flap and then looked back at the jester. She was staring at him again before turning her head to look at the barrel again. Tommy didn't know what her motivations were, but she hadn't given him up when she could have, and he owed her something for that. She seemed to want Tommy to walk over to the barrel, and he decided as long as she was still tied up and the clown was gone, he could at least give her that. In moments, Tommy was standing a few inches away from the barrel, and he saw now that the jester had not been looking at the barrel itself at all. She had been looking at the large, red-splattered knife that lay on top. Tommy gingerly took the knife in his hands. What was he going to do with this? Defend himself? A fully grown adult could easily disarm a small child, even if they had no weapons. Did she want him to cut her loose? Tommy looked back at the jester, who still stared silently. He didn't want to cut her loose. He didn't want to leave her tied up. This morning, his only concern had been if he could stand the weight of the drive to reach the carnival. Now it felt as if his brain would burst and his stomach leave his body entirely. The weight of the suddenly very big decisions and intense fear weighed down on his small frame. And then he felt a tug on the knife. Glancing up, he saw the jester had reached forward with her stocking-clad legs and gingerly plucked the knife from his hands by pressing the blade between her 2 feet. Tommy watched, as if in a trance, as the jester clasped the knife in the toes of one foot, turned her leg in an impossible position, and began to saw the ropes that bound her. He didn't know what she would do once she was free, and holding a knife, he didn't plan to stick around to find out. He turned and ran from the tent. The blast of hot, sticky air hit his face as he exited. The smells and sound that were muted inside the tent once again returned in full. Where was the fortune-teller's tent? He knew he had to find his parents in order to escape. He saw the large Ferris wheel to his right, and remembered he and his parents walking past it earlier on their way to the fortune-teller's tent. The Ferris wheel was no longer moving as it had been earlier, but it was still lit up with the same brightly colored lights and the same pipe music emanated from nearby. The operator station was now empty. Tommy rushed past the giant rusty contraption in the general direction he remembered going earlier, and with a sigh of relief, he spotted it. The fortune-teller's tent was one of the few pavilions in the carnival that was not red and white, so spotting the deep purple-hued canvas was easy amongst the sea of stripes. Sprinting with all of his might, no longer caring about secrecy in a carnival that now seemed empty of even the workers, Tommy dashed across the stony ground toward the amethyst tent. He burst inside, out of breath, and found the interior of the fortune-teller's tent was no different from the rest of the place. It was empty, with neither his parents nor the fortune-teller anywhere to be found. Desperation welled up inside Tommy and brought stinging tears to his eyes. Where were they? He slowly sank to the ground, feeling helpless, hopeless. Where could he go? What chance did he have? The clown had mentioned all remaining cars were sabotaged, hadn't he? And even if they weren't, he didn't have keys. He didn't know how to drive. He was 10 years old. Tommy frowned. Wait a minute. Hadn't the carney mentioned something about everybody being in the big top? Could his parents be there too? A renewed hope sparked inside him. If there were even a chance his parents were inside the big top, he had to go see. Jumping to his feet and wiping away tears from his dirty, streaked face, Tommy ran back out of the tent. The big top was easy to spot, no matter where one was in the rest of the carnival. The massive ivory and cardinal stripes tent towered over all others. Situated near the back of the carnival, it was easily 3 times as large as the next biggest tent, in both height and weight. They had been inside earlier in the day, Tommy and his parents. They watched the acrobats from dizzying heights near the canvas roof perform twirls and jumps as the large mustached ringmaster standing on the platform below bellowed out the names of the tricks being performed. The space inside was huge, with a large circular stone floor in the middle, surrounded on all sides by raised wooden bleachers. As Tommy apprehensively approached the towering structure now, he could hear voices and shouts inside combining with music which seemed louder than it had then. He felt himself walking slower and slower the closer he got to the big top, a feeling of dread climbing back up into his stomach. The clown would be there, he knew. Everyone would. If his parents were still in their dazed state from before, they probably wouldn't be in any shape to protect him from the clown. And that was if he could even find his parents at all. And then Tommy heard a noise that was not coming from the big top. It was a clanking, metal-on-metal noise coming from somewhere over to his left. Tommy's head whirled to look in that direction. The jester was kneeling near the front of an old roller coaster. Her back was turned, but Tommy could easily tell from the costume, hat, and white-gloved hands that it was the same one he had seen in the tent. The coaster she was working on was shaped like a dragon, and one of the metal flaps near the front was lifted, revealing engine machinery inside, and a maze of differently colored wires all attached to each other. The track of the coaster was in no shape for a ride. It wasn't even a complete circuit. It made a wide loop before circling back and heading for the edge of the carnival, and that was where it ended. The broken track beginning an upward arc before suddenly stopping, a few inches of jagged metal bars remaining. It looked like the track itself had been ripped away by some powerful unknown force. The jester hadn't noticed Tommy yet, until she suddenly looked up and spotted him. Tommy froze. The jester quickly stood, and Tommy could see she had picked up the red-splattered knife from the ground. She began walking towards him quickly, and then stopped when she saw Tommy backing away. Wordlessly, she pointed at the seat in the coaster, and in a flash, Tommy understood. She was going to fix up the old coaster, probably using the wires from the cars they sabotaged. She was going to fix up the coaster, turn it on, and launch over the fence and out into the desert. Though most coasters were usually propelled by the track, this one appeared to have an engine in the front car. Tommy's heart leaped with excitement. Was there actually hope? Would the jester's plan actually work? And just as quickly, his excitement faded. He couldn't leave without his parents. He just couldn't. And that meant entering the big top with no guarantee the jester would wait for them. Please. The voice that came out of Tommy's dry throat was pathetic sounding, even to him. It was cracked, tired, and tiny all at the same time. There are other seats on the dragon. Please let me find my parents first. Please don't leave until we get back. The jester made no reply or any facial expression of any kind. She simply sat and stared, the dark red line across one cheekbone from the clown, and the bright blue of the painted tear on her other cheek, the only bits of color on the blank white face. Tommy didn't have time to try to decipher her intentions, let alone the ability. Just give me a few minutes. I'll be back with them, I promise. And with that, he turned and ran towards the big top, a renewed sense of purpose filling his mind. There was actually hope now. Only a small bit, but hope nonetheless. He very well could find his parents without much incident, and the jester very well could wait for them until they came back. And there was a very good chance the coaster would launch off the track and over the carnival's outer fence just fine. Tommy chose to believe, because it did him absolutely no good to focus on what would happen if anything went wrong. As he ran towards the big top opening, the music grew louder, mixing with the laughing and roaring of people. When he first entered the tent, the coppery stench of blood washing over him was the first thing he noticed. He gagged and covered his nose and quickly ducked under the raised wooden bleachers. From beneath the timbered seats, he could see a long line of people, regular people dressed in regular clothes. They all stood, glassy-eyed in a straight line, not one of them moving. Tommy turned to look in the center of the ring where it seemed every single person who worked in the carnival had gathered. They were all dancing, laughing, eating, and swimming in a sea of blood, with body parts strewn about the ocean of gore like small islands. One of the workers grabbed the next dazed fairgoer in front of the line and pulled him in. From there, knives and hooks from a dozen different clowns and carnies ripped into his flesh, along with the bared hands of the ones who didn't have a weapon. In mere moments, the man's body disintegrated and joined the slowly rising flood of blood and carnage in the center ring. Tommy stared for a moment, and then came to a decision. It was too much. His brain didn't need to fully process what he was seeing, and so he wouldn't. And just like that, he blocked it out. It didn't matter. The entire carnival didn't matter. Nothing mattered except finding his parents. He set his mind on that goal and ignored everything else. His eyes scanned the line of people for his parents, unwilling to look at anything beyond. And just like that, he spotted them. His parents were standing near the back of the line, not too far from where he crouched beneath the bleachers. They still wore vacant expressions, like in the fortune-teller's tent, but they were otherwise unharmed. Tommy quickly darted over to them, grabbing both of their hands. "Mother, Father, please wake up. Please look at me. We have to go." He pulled at their hands and sleeves with the most violent energy his 10-year-old body could muster. He would not allow them to remain standing there. The loud music and roars of the carnivorous ones in the center of the ring muffled his cries, but somehow his parents still heard him. "Tommy?" His mother was the first to slowly speak, her unfocused eyes struggling to lock onto her son. His father, too, was very slowly beginning to come around. He hadn't spoken yet, but both he and mother were allowing themselves to be pulled along by Tommy toward the tent exit. Neither were in any shape to do much more than allow themselves to be pulled along blindly, but it was enough. Tommy felt a thrill of excitement. It was working. They were on their way back. There was no sign of the clown, though he must have been one of the many standing in the middle of the slaughter. Tommy's young mind had been subjected to more intense horror and fear than he had ever felt in his entire life, and he simply couldn't take it anymore. His single goal that he clung to fiercely in his mind was bringing his parents back to the Dragon Coaster, taking off with the Jester, and leaving the carnival behind forever. So, when he felt the hands clamp down firmly on his shoulders and saw the white gloves they were covered with, he knew he had a choice to make. The white gloves were those of the Jester, not the clown's, he decided. And so that's what reality was. It had to be. He felt his body go limp with shock, but his brain was still barely processing sensations. As he felt himself be pulled along, he let himself believe it was the Jester pulling him and leading his parents to the coaster, because that was the only option that was acceptable. He had seen the bodies of some of the victims being danced with by the carnival workers in all the slaughter, spinning them around in a kind of warped ballroom dance. But the shifts in gravity he felt now in his stomach could also be the roller coaster taking off, speeding around the track and leaping over the fence into the desert. Tommy tried to open his eyes to see what was happening, but he could barely get them to budge. Only the tiniest slit opened to let in light, but all Tommy could see was the color red. The desert was red, wasn't it? Yes, very much so, especially in the dim evening light. As a warm darkness overtook him, Tommy knew they must be escaping into the hot desert night, with bright shining stars overhead to guide them home.